A hand grabbed a woman's wrist and twisted it hard behind her back. She bit down on a scream. A metal ladle clattered to the floor. Her knees buckled against the edge of the stove and hot broth splashed across her forearm. She didn't cry out. She'd learned not to. A boot scraped the boards behind her and a low voice told her to shut her mouth and keep stirring. She nodded. She always nodded. Her free hand pressed flat against the counter, knuckles white, while the burn on her skin turned an angry red. Nobody in that ranch house heard a thing. Nobody ever did. Her name was Nora Vance, and she had been swallowing her own pain for 2 long years. But that night, an old dog by the door started to growl low. What that growl set loose would change everything. Stay with me on this one. The supper bell on the Circle M rang at 6 every night, and every night the men came in loud and left louder. Not tonight. Tonight they ate fast, kept their heads down, and cleared out without a word. Duke Rawlins noticed. Noticing things was the job. He was the foreman. 40 years in the saddle had left him with a bad hip and a slower walk, but nothing on that ranch got by him. He'd hired most of those men. He knew which ones drank, which ones sent money home, which ones you could trust with a green Colt. And he knew the cook fed them better than they deserved. Her name was Nora Vance. She'd come to the Circle M 2 years back, right after her husband Tom died under a rolled wagon out on the North Road. Tom had worked the ranch. When he passed, he left her with nothing but debt and a place to sleep, and old man Mercer let her stay on as cook to work it off. She was young, not yet 30, quiet. She never asked for a thing. Duke had watched her turn that sorry kitchen into the best-fed table in 3 counties, biscuits that melted, stew that stuck to your ribs on a cold night. The men grumbled about everything under the sun, but they never once grumbled about Nora's cooking. That was its own kind of respect if you knew cowhands. There was one hand, a big Swede named Ostergaard, who'd ridden through half the states in the West, and he swore up and down there wasn't a hotel in Denver that set a finer plate than the Widow Vance. The men believed him. So did Duke. But lately something had changed in her. Duke couldn't name it at first. She flinched when a door banged. She wore long sleeves in the July heat. She stopped looking men in the eye, even him, and Nora had never been afraid of him. He chalked it up to grief. Grief did strange things to people, and he of all men understood that. He'd buried a wife himself, 20 years gone, and never remarried. He knew the way grief could hollow a person out, make them small and quiet. But even as he told himself that, some part of him wasn't buying it. Grief didn't leave marks. Grief didn't make a woman look at the door like she was waiting for something bad to walk through it. Then came the dog. Ranger was old. A German shepherd, gray around the muzzle, half deaf, with hips near as bad as Duke's own. He'd been Tom's dog, and after Tom died, the animal had attached himself to Nora and never let go. Most days Ranger slept in the kitchen doorway where it was warm. He didn't bother anybody. He didn't have the teeth for it anymore. The hands would step over him coming in for supper, and he wouldn't so much as lift his head. A ranch dog that's given up on being a ranch dog. That's what everybody figured he was. But that evening, as Duke crossed the yard toward the cookhouse, he heard the dog. Not a bark, a growl. Low and steady, the kind that comes up from somewhere deep, the kind an old dog only makes when he means it. Duke stopped in the dark and listened. The growl was coming from the kitchen, and underneath it, faint, he heard something else. A woman trying not to cry and failing. Now Duke Rawlins was not a man who pushed into places he wasn't wanted. He'd spent his whole life minding his own, but standing there in the cooling dust, listening to that sound, something in his chest turned over. He'd heard that particular kind of crying before. It wasn't grief. Grief was loud or it was silent. This was the sound of somebody who'd learned to cry without making noise, so nobody would ask why. He climbed the 2 steps to the door. The kitchen was warm and yellow with lamplight. Nora stood at the big iron stove with her back to him, stirring a pot she'd already stirred enough. Her shoulders shook. Ranger stood beside her, stiff-legged and bristling, his cloudy eyes fixed past Duke, toward the far door that led out to the bunkhouse. The dog didn't even look at the foreman. Whatever he was growling at, it wasn't Duke. "Nora," Duke said, soft as he could make it. She went rigid. She swiped at her face with the back of her wrist and turned halfway, giving him a smile that didn't hold. "Supper's done, Mr. Rawlins. There's plenty left if you're hungry. I can fix you a plate." "I'm not hungry." "I'll wrap some for you then, for later." Her voice came too bright, too fast. She reached for a cloth and her sleeve rode up. That's when Duke saw it. Just for a second before she yanked the cuff back down. A ring of dark bruises around her forearm. 4 of them, close together, spaced like fingers. Like a hand had closed around her arm and squeezed until it left a mark. Duke had seen enough livestock and enough men to know exactly what he was looking at. Somebody had grabbed her, hard, and not for the first time because the bruises were layered old yellow underneath the fresh purple. He didn't say anything about it, not yet. He just looked at that old dog, still growling at the bunkhouse door, and he understood what the animal already knew. Duke didn't demand anything. He didn't tell her to keep working. He did something no man on that ranch had ever done for Nora Vance. He walked to the bunkhouse door, the one Ranger was watching, and he turned the lock. The bolt slid home with a soft click. Then he crossed to the yard door and locked that one too. And then, slow on account of his hip, he pulled a chair out from the little table by the window, turned it, and sat down. "Sit with me a minute," he said. Nora didn't move. "I've got dishes." "This has'll keep." "Mr. Mercer don't like." "Amos Mercer's asleep in his bed and hasn't set foot in this kitchen in a year. Sit down, Nora, please." It was the please that did it. She lowered herself onto the bench across from him like her legs had quit on her, and she folded her hands in her lap where he couldn't see them, and she stared at the table. Ranger came and lay down across her feet, still facing the bunkhouse, still rumbling low in his chest. For a long moment, Duke said nothing. He'd learned that from horses. You don't rush a frightened thing. You let it come to you. "That's a good dog," he finally said. "Tom's dog, weren't he?" "Yes, sir." "He don't growl at nothing. Old as he is, takes a lot to get him up." Nora's chin trembled. She pressed her lips together hard. Duke leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and he asked her the one question nobody in 2 years had thought to ask. "Nora, who put those bruises on your arm?" She shook her head, fast. "I burned myself on the stove. I'm clumsy, that's all, always have been." "Those aren't burns." "Mr. Rawlins." "Nora," he said it gentle, but it stopped her. "I've been around a long time. I know a burn from a hand. Somebody grabbed you. Somebody's been grabbing you a while now. And that dog there knows exactly who." Duke nodded at Ranger. "Question is whether you're gonna tell me or whether I've got to figure it out my own self. And I will figure it out. I'm slow, but I get there." The tears came then. Not the quiet kind she'd trained herself into. Real ones, breaking loose all at once, like a dam that had held too long. She pressed both hands over her mouth to keep the sound down out of pure habit, and that habit was maybe the saddest thing Duke had ever seen. "He'll put me out," she whispered. "If I say, he'll put me out on the road with nothing, and I got nowhere. I got no people. Tom's debt is in my name now, all of it, and he holds the paper. He told me. He told me 100 times. One word out of me and I'm gone, and the law comes after me for the money, and where does an old dog go then? They'd shoot Ranger. Nobody keeps a dog that old." "Who, Nora?" Duke's voice had gone flat and quiet. "Who holds the paper? Who's been hurting you?" She looked up at him, and the name came out of her small and broken. Clyde Mercer." Duke sat back slow. Clyde, Amos Mercer's son, the only son. The man who kept the ranch books who'd take over the whole spread the day his old father finally passed. Clyde Mercer, who came out to the cookhouse late at night when the men were asleep, because who was going to stop him? It was his family's kitchen. It was his family's cook. It was, in his mind, his. It started slow, Nora said. Once it began, she couldn't stop it. After Tom died, he was kind at first, said he'd take care of the debt, said not to worry. Then he wanted things for it, and when I said no, she swallowed. The first time he just grabbed my arm, said I owed the family, said I'd cost them a hand and the least I could do. Then it got to be more. He comes when he's been drinking. Some nights he just stands over me and talks, tells me what I am, tells me nobody in the county would take my word over his. Other nights he grabs. Ranger stands between us best he can, but he's old and Clyde kicked him so hard last month the poor thing limped a week. So now I don't fight. I just let him grab and yell and I wait for him to leave. It's easier when I don't fight. Duke's jaw worked. His hands had curled into fists on his knees without him telling them to. He made himself open them. Does anybody else know? Who'd believe the cook over the boss's son? And who'd care? I'm nobody, Mr. Rollins. I'm the woman who feeds them. That's all I am here. You're wrong about that, Duke said, but we'll get to it. He thought about the men that evening, how they'd eaten fast and cleared out without a word. He understood it now. They'd known. Not all of it, maybe, but enough. Enough to know it was safer to look at their plates than to look at the door Clyde came through. He didn't blame them exactly, but he didn't forgive it either. He stood up and his hip complained and he ignored it. He walked to the window and looked out across the dark yard toward the main house, where a single lamp still burned in an upstairs room, Clyde's room. The man was awake up there, maybe drinking. Duke watched that light a long time. Then he turned back and his face had gone calm, too calm. You're done cooking for tonight, he said. Bank the stove, take the dog. There's a spare room off the tack house, clean, got a good door with a bolt on the inside. You sleep there tonight. Nobody bothers you there. In the morning we'll sort the rest. Nora blinked at him. You do that. Already done. He picked her shawl off the peg and handed it to her, careful not to touch her arm. Go on now, get some rest. First real rest you've had in 2 years, I expect. And for the first time in all that while, the fear loosened in Nora's face. She wiped her cheeks. She called the dog. Ranger got up stiff and followed her out into the night, and Duke watched the two of them cross the yard to the tack house, and he heard the bolt slide shut behind her, safe. He stood alone in the warm kitchen. It was quiet. The stew ticked as it cooled. For a moment, everything felt settled. The danger felt over. He'd found the trouble, he'd got her somewhere safe, and tomorrow he'd handle it like a man handles a thing. Easy. Done. He turned down the lamp and reached for the door. Behind him, out in the dark, a boot came down on the porch step. The yard door rattled. Then it swung open and Clyde Mercer filled the frame. He was big. Bigger than his father had ever been, 28 and thick through the shoulders, with a young man's belly starting under a fine shirt. A glass of his daddy's whiskey hung in one hand. He looked at Duke, and he looked at the empty kitchen, and his face soured. "Where's the cook?" Clyde said, and right there the whole thing changed. Because Duke understood, standing in that dark kitchen, that this was never going to be one man settling a score with another. Clyde Mercer wasn't just a bully with a grip. He was the boss. He owned the roof over Duke's head, the horse under Duke, the wages in Duke's pocket, and the paper on Nora's debt. He had the law in his family's back pocket in a county where the Mercer name was the only name that mattered. This wasn't about a bruise anymore. Say one wrong word, and by morning Duke could be run off the only home he'd known for 40 years, Nora dragged to jail over Tom's debt, and that old dog put down. Fighting one drunk was simple. Fighting the Mercers was something else entirely. Duke measured all of that in about 2 seconds. Then he stepped between Clyde and the door to the yard. "Cook's turned in," Duke said. "Kitchen's closed." "Closed?" Clyde laughed, and the whiskey moved in the glass. "You don't close nothing on my ranch, old man. Where is she? She's got a habit of hiding when I come by. You seen her sleep in that little room off the tack house. Bolts it up like that keeps me out." He took a slow drink. "It don't." Something cold ran through Duke. So Clyde already knew where she'd gone. He'd known all along. That bolt she trusted, that little room she'd been running to for 2 years, it had never once kept the man out. It had only made her feel like it might. "You're gonna leave her be," Duke said quietly. Clyde set the glass down on the counter hard enough to slop. He came a step closer. He had 6 inches and 30 years on the foreman, and he knew it. "You work for me, Rawlins, or you will, soon as the old man dies, which the doctor says ain't long. You want to keep drawing a check when I'm running this place. You'll mind the horses and stay the hell out of my kitchen. That woman owes this family. She pays how I say she pays. That's business. You understand business, don't you? Old broke-down foreman with no wife, no land, no place to go. What have you got 40 years in? And nothing to show. You'd be a fool to lose your bunk over another man's widow." And here's the thing. Duke Rawlins had spent his whole life keeping his head down and his mouth shut. He'd watched wrongs go by because it wasn't his business, because a man's got to eat, because that's how it was. He told himself that 1,000 times. He told himself that the night Tom Vance's wagon rolled and nobody thought to check the load. He told himself that 100 nights since, watching Nora go quiet and small. It had always worked before. It didn't work now. Before I tell you what Duke did, let me say this. If you've ever known a Nora or been one, if this story's got its hand around your heart the way it's got mine, do me a kindness and hit that subscribe button and stay with me to the end. Because what happened next is the part I've been wanting to tell you. Duke looked up at the big man, and he said, real soft, "You kicked that dog." Clyde blinked. "What?" "Old dog, half blind, can barely walk, and you kicked him so hard he limped a week because he stood between you and a scared woman." Duke nodded slow, like he was finally understanding something. "A man who'll do that. There's nothing in him, nothing at all." "You watch your mouth." "No," Duke said, "I don't believe I will, not anymore." Clyde's face went dark red. He reached out and shoved Duke in the chest hard, the way he'd shoved 100 smaller men. "You're fired, old man. Pack your—" He never finished it. Duke, off balance from the shove, put his boot behind Clyde's ankle and turned his shoulder into him, and the big man went down against the corner of the table, all that weight and whiskey working against him, and he hit the floor with a sound that shook the pots on their hooks. For a second Clyde just lay there, stunned that the ground had come up to meet him. Then the rage took over. He came up roaring, swinging, and this time it wasn't shove. This time it was fists. The first one caught Duke on the cheek and split it open. The old man staggered back into the stove and felt the heat of it. Clyde came in swinging again, wild, and Duke did the only thing 40 years of hard work had left him strong enough to do. He grabbed hold and hung on. He got both arms locked around the younger man and held him close, chest to chest, where a big man can't get room to hit. They crashed around that kitchen. A shelf came down. The whiskey glass shattered. Clyde was younger and stronger, and he knew it, and he got a hand free and drove his fist into Duke's ribs once, twice, and Duke felt something crack, and his grip started to go. The younger man was too much. Duke had known it going in. He'd known it the second Clyde filled that doorway. He just hadn't cared. "You're dead," Clyde panted in his ear. "You hear me? You and her and that mangy." That's when the bunkhouse door blew open. Nora stood there. She hadn't gone to sleep. She'd heard the crash from across the yard, and she'd come running, and she'd unlocked the very door she'd hidden behind for 2 years. And she wasn't alone. Ranger came in low and fast, faster than an old dog should be able to move. 60 pounds of gray fury that had been waiting 2 years for one clean shot at the man who kicked him. He hit Clyde Mercer at the back of the knee and clamped down, and this time there was nothing wrong with those old teeth at all. Clyde screamed and let go of Duke. He kicked back at the dog, but Ranger had learned that trick and rode it out, growling through his grip. Duke got his feet under him. He got his air back. And when Clyde turned, off balance, arms flailing at the dog, Duke Rawlins hit him one time, square on the jaw, everything he had left behind it. Clyde Mercer folded up and went down and stayed down. For a moment nobody moved. The lamp swung on its hook, throwing light around the wrecked kitchen. Duke stood there with his chest heaving and his ribs screaming and blood running down his cheek. Nora had both hands over her mouth again. And Ranger let go of the leg and backed off, standing over the fallen man, growling low, daring him to get up. Clyde groaned and rolled onto his side. Not out, just done. He looked up at the three of them, the old foreman, the widow, and the dog, and for the first time in his soft, cruel life, Clyde Mercer looked afraid. "You're finished," he slurred, blood on his teeth. "All of you, my father." "Your father," said a voice from the doorway, "is right here." Amos Mercer stood in the yard door in his nightshirt, thin as a fence rail, leaning on a cane, gray as the dog. Nobody had heard him cross the yard. He was old and sick and dying, but his eyes were clear, and they were fixed on his son on the floor. "I've been standing on that porch 5 full minutes," Amos said. His voice shook, but not from weakness. Long enough to hear every word you said, Clyde, about the woman, about the debt, about what you've been doing in my house, while I lay dying upstairs and trusted you to run things decent. Pa, he attacked me, he." "Shut up." The old man's cane cracked against the floor. Ranger flinched, but Amos looked at the dog and something in his hard old face broke a little. "You kicked Tom Vance's dog, Tom Vance who died working my cattle on my road. You put your hands on his widow, in my kitchen, and you stood there and told my best man 40 years that you'd throw him off my land." He shook his head slow. No, son, you got that backwards." Amos Mercer turned to Duke, and his voice steadied. "Duke, in the morning you ride to town. You bring the sheriff and you bring my lawyer Betancourt, not Clyde's man. Mine," he drew a breath that rattled. "The debt against this woman's name, Tom's debt, it's forgiven, tonight. I'll sign it before I sleep. There never should have been paper on a widow of a man who died in my service, and I was a fool to let my son handle it. That's on me." Nora made a small sound. Amos looked at her, and his face gentled the way it hadn't in years. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Vance. I'm an old man who saw only what was easy to see. You fed my men better than I deserved, and you did it while carrying this alone. That's over now. You've got a home here as long as I've got one to give, and after I'm gone, it'll be in writing so no man can take it from you. Do you hear me?" Nora couldn't speak. She just nodded, tears running. One hand dropped down to rest on Ranger's gray head. Then Amos looked down at his son on the floor, and whatever was in his face then, it wasn't anger anymore. It was grief. The grief of a father seeing plain at the very end of his life what his boy had become. "You'll leave the Circle by noon tomorrow, Clyde, with what fits in one bag. The sheriff'll want a word about the widow, and I won't lift a finger to stop him. You're my son and I love you, and God help me I don't know you. Now get up off that floor and get out of that woman's kitchen." Clyde got up. He was crying now, big soft tears, but not one of them was for Nora, and everybody in that room knew it. He limped out into the dark, past his father, who wouldn't look at him, and he was gone. The sheriff came the next morning. Amos Mercer, true to his word, signed the debt away and set Nora's place at the Circle-M into writing with his own shaking hand, with Betancourt the lawyer as witness. Clyde was gone by noon like his father said, run off to Fort Worth to live on whatever an uncle would spare him, and the county that had always bent to the Mercer name found it didn't much care to protect a man his own father had thrown out. He never came back. Nora never saw him again. Old Amos didn't last the summer. He died in September in his bed, and near the end it was Nora who sat with him, spooning broth she'd made soft enough for a dying man to swallow, and it was Duke who held the old man's hand when he went. Amos had left the running of the ranch to Duke in his will, and a piece of the land free and clear to Nora Vance, the woman who fed his men. He'd learned her name at last. The Circle-M went on. The bell still rang at 6, but the kitchen was different now. The men came in loud and stayed loud, and Nora didn't flinch when a door banged, and she wore short sleeves in the July heat because there was nothing on her arms she needed to hide. She looked people in the eye again. She laughed sometimes, and the sound of it would stop a hard old cowhand right in his tracks, because they'd worked beside her 2 years and never once heard it. Duke Rawlins mended slow. His ribs knitted crooked and ached when the weather turned, and the scar on his cheek stayed with him the rest of his days. He never made much of what he'd done. When one of the younger hands asked him about the night the boss's son got run off, Duke would just shrug and say the dog did most of the work. And then he'd reach down and scratch Ranger behind the ears, because that old dog followed Duke now near as close as he followed Nora, the two of them having reached an understanding that night that didn't need words. Ranger got another 2 good years. He spent them warm and fed and unafraid, sleeping in that kitchen doorway in the sun. When he finally passed in his sleep an old dog's easy death, they buried him out under the cottonwood by Tom's grave, and Duke made the marker himself and carved one word into it: Ranger. Nora cried and Duke put his arm around her, and this time she didn't flinch from a man's touch at all. They married the spring after. Nothing fancy. A preacher, a handful of hands, biscuits that melted and stew that stuck to your ribs. Duke was near 60 and Nora not yet 32, and folks in town talked the way folks do, but neither of them paid it any mind. He'd never once raised his voice to her. Not once. And Nora, who had spent 2 years learning to cry without a sound so nobody would ask, spent the rest of her life in a house where a man had asked, one time in a warm kitchen, the only question that had ever mattered. You want to know what real strength looks like? It's not the big man's fist. Clyde Mercer had all the size and all the power and all the money, and in the end he had nothing, because there was nothing in him. Real strength was a broke-down old foreman with a bad hip who sat down in a chair instead of giving an order, who turned a lock to keep a frightened woman safe instead of shut in, who asked the quiet question when it would have been so much easier to walk on by and mind his own. Anybody can look away. It's the easiest thing in the world. Duke Rawlins looked, and then he did something about it, and it cost him his ribs and near cost him his home. He'd tell you it was the best trade he ever made. So the next time you see somebody wearing long sleeves in the heat, the next time you hear somebody crying quiet, the kind of quiet that's been practiced, the next time an old dog won't stop growling at a door, don't look away, pull up a chair, ask the question. You might just be the first person who ever did.